Hey team, and welcome to our magical eclipse video coming to you live from eclipse season. We're going to talk about some magical election opportunities that we're going to have between our Taurus Lunar Eclipse on April 30th until our, our Taurus Solar Eclipse on April 30th and our Scorpio Lunar Eclipse on May 15th. So like I said, we are kind of caught between eclipses, between our next couple of lunations. And eclipses are always kind of a weird thing to talk about magically because there are kind of some varying ideas about how eclipses are handled across some traditions. More modern traditions tend to view lunar eclipses or eclipses in general as much more positive or potentially positive, whereas more historical traditions tend to view them as much more negative. So of course, coming from the astrological magic perspective, very much in the camp of eclipses are potentially dangerous and toxic and should be avoided in magical working entirely, like complete blackout dates, not good to work with. Very specific benefit for a whole bunch of risk that ends up not being worth it. I've worked with a lot of people who have had eclipse talismans or eclipse magical experiences kind of turned sour on them and helping them correct it. So definitely I'm recommending no eclipse specific workings. And even then, some different practitioners will have different ideas about what that means exactly. For me, I just tend to say it as if the eclipse is not happening or being invoked in your talismanic ritual, then you're probably fine. But I know that there are some other practitioners who kind of block out whole days surrounding the eclipse or like whole signs. And so everybody kind of has their own difference about what exactly that blackout looks like. But I tend to be kind of very specific in mine, in that as long as the eclipse isn't happening, then you're probably fine. Today, I'm joined by my co-host Bubbles, who, yeah, there she is. Turn around, Bubbles. Turn around. One of my co-host Bubbles, who's very excited to be here. Yeah, very excited. But she's not very excited about being picked up. Okay, and then I don't know if you can see that orange. Hold on, try my finger. Okay, this orange right here, this orange bit over the blue chair. That's Lee, chilling, but he's here too. Pet him with my finger. There you go. Oh, he heard me. He said, "What?" There's his ears. He's here too. Lee, 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 Lee. Hey. Lee. It's not. Don't know what I expected. It's not working. But all right, let's go ahead and dive into our electional opportunities. Even though this is, of course, eclipse season, that doesn't mean that we're totally blacked out for astrological magic. We do have some decent electional opportunities during this time period. We are dealing with the waxing moon, which opens us up to more growth and gain oriented stuff. So we definitely want to make sure that we're clear of the eclipse, that the eclipse is not factoring into this at all when we're working with some of these elections during this time period. So that's not super hard for me because I generally black out new and full moon dates for talismanic magic anyway. So here you go. Just do that same thing all the time and you will automatically skip eclipses. So that's good. But we're going to go ahead and handle this with Western Europe and North Africa first, then Australia, and then we're going to close up by talking about the elections in North America because they have the most this time around. Our lucky winners, I guess we'll say. So our first electional opportunity for North America, no. So our first electional opportunity for Western Europe and North Africa is going to be for May 4th at around 4:30 in the afternoon. And this is going to be an opportunity for a 7th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 7th Lunar Mansion is another one that is very similar in spirit to the 3rd Lunar Mansion. You know, my favorite mansion, I talk about it a lot. And that the 7th Lunar Mansion is useful for the acquisition of good things, for the development and the production of good things. So it's very flexible in its powers, much like the 3rd Lunar Mansion, who is also said to be for the acquisition of all good things. Generally, you just want to make sure that your chart lines up to be able to provide those good things for you, and whatever that means. But I enjoy the 7th and the 3rd Lunar Mansions for their flexibility, just because almost any kind of situation that you could possibly need some sort of help in, or positive development in, the 7th or 3rd Lunar Mansions can catch and help you with that. So it makes it very easy. It feels very nice to have these two mansions that you can kind of look forward to see if you can get an election for every month. Just kind of like, no matter what life throws at you, there's always a 3rd or a 7th Lunar Mansion talisman to be able to help you with. So if you're in a situation where you can use a couple of good things, whatever that looks like to you, I definitely recommend picking up and holding on to a 7th or a 3rd Lunar Mansion talisman if you're able to get it to look well in your location. So looking at our election chart here for this, we've got the moon on the midheaven in the 7th lunar mansion, and here she is applying the square aspect to Jupiter in Pisces. So generally square aspects are less ideal in our elections. We typically want to focus more, sextiles, trines, conjunctions, those more obviously harmonious or easy aspects, just to facilitate a little bit less energy on our part. Usually, the aspect that the moon is making, the moon's next aspect, especially in regards to lunar mansion talismans, tells us a lot about, it's very similar to like horary or elections, but it tells us a lot about kind of like how much am I going to have to do? How much work am I going to have to do in this to make this happen? Like what do I kind of need to, how involved do I need to be to make this work versus kind of like how involved or maybe not that, but like how much luxury I'm just kind of like sitting back and letting things go do I have? And that's really what the moon's next aspect tends to work as. So ideally you want really nice, really easy, really strong connections via like conjunctions or trines where things just kind of fall into place and there's very little that you have to do about it. And then like connections to strong planets or well-placed planets help make that even easier, because then that planet kind of takes it over and there's very little you have to do after that point. Just kind of sit back and enjoy the ride. But when you start getting into like squares, there's a little bit more work involved on your part. Like it takes a little bit more oomph to make everything kind of fit where it needs to go. You kind of have to push the puzzle piece in a little bit. And so generally squares are of course less ideal connections for the moon in talismanic election charts. And so then it comes down to like, okay, well, what planet is this connecting to? Because you'll never want squares with Mars or Saturn. You'll never want squares with malefic planets. But when it comes to like Venus or even the Sun or Jupiter, squares are easier because that sort of benefic ability for those benefic planets, that sort of good-naturedness, helps to mitigate some of the stress or effort that the square implies. So squares, not the best aspect, but any aspect is better than no aspect. Squares are always better than oppositions, which I will never work with. I'll never work with an opposition in an election chart again. They can still be useful. We can still count on them, especially when the planet on the other end of that square is Jupiter in his sign of domicile in Pisces. So I recommend it just from that perspective as well. A nice, strong Jupiter connection. The square is only like 3 degrees apart. The moon is well placed. There's no intervention between Saturn or Mars and the moon, which is great. The ruler of the first house is Mercury here in Gemini in the 9th house. Mercury is unafflicted by Mars or Saturn, about 11 degrees away from this Mars square still, so we don't have to worry so much about that. Mercury is getting slow here because it's about to turn retrograde, and the moon is slow in this chart. So we might have to wait a little bit for the talisman to have a good effect. Slow moons tend to slow down the talisman's manifestation ability. But otherwise, it's good to have if you need it. It's definitely not what I would call the best 7th lunar mansion talisman I've ever seen, obviously. But as long as the moon is going to be slow around like this area of the zodiac, especially like Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, these lunar mansions are going to be a little bit disadvantaged in that like ability to manifest quickly kind of thing. So our second electional opportunity for Western Europe and North Africa is going to be on May 6th at just after 9:30 in the morning. And this is going to be an opportunity for a 9th lunar mansion talisman. The 9th lunar mansion is one of those talismans that is a little bit like dual-edged, we'll say, in that it has some really strong cursing potential, which I don't recommend using it for. But it also has some pretty strong, in waxing moon context, it has some pretty strong spiritual defense applications. So definitely recommend more that aspect of it or utilization of it. So if you're in any kind of situation where you feel like you could use that, or if having a talisman that you could incorporate in some sort of like malefic attachment severance ritual to use more as a tool in that regard, the 9th lunar mansion can definitely help you to do that, especially in my opinion when it comes to protections and cutting of evil eye afflictions, just due to the image primarily that the 9th lunar mansion is given a eunuch with his eyes covered. I think is kind of unique. Or a telling, I guess we'll say, posture to adopt. So taking a look at our election, we can have the moon here in the first house in the 9th lunar mansion, and the moon is a little bit back from the ascendant in this chart because I wanted to be able to maintain this really close, really tight trine with Mars in Pisces here, 59 Cancer to 16 Pisces, which was a really strong and unique setup that I wanted to be able to take advantage of if I could get it. Just sounds super cool having this like really nice easy connection to Mars, who I think operates very well in like protective kinds of settings. So definitely recommend being able to use that when you can. Sort of like the nice, or like the more constructive application of the Mars warrior archetype, I guess we'll call it. Definitely very useful to have on your side. Definitely very useful to have, you know, pointing those swords elsewhere, to kind of help you to keep difficult spiritual gunk off of you, or, you know, Mars's nature is to sever and separate, of course. So being able to separate, or sever the ties that more, you know, heavy, negative spiritual stuff can accumulate on us. Just cut that right off and, you know, let it go into the aether, we'll say. Mars can be very helpful to do that. Because the moon is both the moon and the ruler of the first house with Cancer rising, we really only have to look to her to make sure that she's safe and that there aren't any kind of difficult relationships with other planets. We've got the trine to Mars, so we don't have to worry about like a sextile or I'm sorry, a square in opposition with Mars afflicting the moon. The moon's averse to Saturn. The ascendant is also unafflicted. So all in all, just a really kind of nice election for spiritual protection talisman. Definitely recommend picking it up if you are interested in having something along those lines. Our third and final election for Western Europe and North Africa is going to be on May 7th at just after 10:45 in the morning, and this is going to be an opportunity for a 10th Lunar Mansion talisman. And the 10th Lunar Mansion is really awesome. I really like this one too. It's very health-oriented, very preventative health-oriented, very kind of repairing the body or keeping the body safe, just sort of like a gentle healing modality. Very effective when it comes to figuring out health conditions that may be kind of mysterious or unusual or a little weird, I guess we'll say, like kind of non-standard, like mystery illness kind of things. We're not really 100% sure what's going on with you. 10th Lunar Mansion is really awesome at getting those solved. 10th Lunar Mansion is also very awesome when it comes to finding a doctor, or getting a doctor who matches well with you and what you need. All in all, the 10th Lunar Mansion is a really great mansion. I recommend it all the time to people whenever we can have opportunities for it, and we have that coming up. Looking at our election chart here, we have the moon very angular in the 10th Lunar Mansion, and at this time she's applying now a very tight trine to Jupiter in Pisces, which I think is so cool for this kind of election chart to have, just because of Jupiter's own really stabilizing and health-oriented powers. The moon is the ruler of the first house, so we only have to look out for kind of difficult connections with the moon or the ascendant. And Saturn is averse, and we're separating kind of from this trine of Mars that we had in the previous election. So we don't have any issues there. And all in all, this is just like a really awesome chart to have with super angular benefic conjunction in the 10th. The moon applying the trine to it. No influence with the malefics at all. A really awesome election. Really glad that that I was able to find it and be able to share it. It's almost unfortunate that this could not serve also as a Jupiter talisman, but since it takes place during Saturn's day and the Sun's hour, I'm like, what you gonna do? There's not a whole lot you can really do about it, unfortunately. But you know, the bad news is no Jupiter talisman. The good news is 10th Lunar Mansion talisman. And so those are all our election opportunities for Western Europe and North Africa. Just sort of a very concentrated burst on the 4th, 6th, and 7th of the month. And that's just kind of how it is this go around. It's just like a lot of concentrated stuff in the beginning of the month, and then less as things go on. And hopefully that doesn't bode ill for our waning moon half of this month. But I guess we'll have to see when we get there. But it's like I said, it's a similar story, just kind of everywhere with this. But moving on into Australia, they have a very similar setup with all of their elections happening basically within like 2 days. So, you know, that's just how it goes. We're going to be very busy for a couple of days, and then we'll get the rest of the week off, which is fine. You know, that's fine too. We can always handle that, take some recreation. But taking a look at our Australian elections, our first election is going to be for May 6th at around 11:20 in the morning, and this is going to be an opportunity for a 9th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 9th Lunar Mansion is one that has kind of dual purpose. In waning moon talismans, it would primarily be utilized as a curse talisman, but in waxing moon context, we can utilize it a lot for spiritual protection, which is what I recommend anybody who wants to work with it this way. Very useful to be able to protect oneself from, you know, spiritual gunk that we accumulate in our day-to-day lives. It can also be very useful for helping to weaken and sever malefic attachments that have, you know, connected themselves to us for one reason or another, due to, you know, improper spiritual hygiene or just, you know, bad, like taking an opportunity to kind of latch onto us or things like that. So the 9th is very useful. I also like to use, I also think it can be very helpful for evil eye, for helping protect against the evil eye. So all in all, the 9th is just a really nice kind of spiritual protection talisman. And I recommend people have one if that's something that they're interested in and haven't been able to find one by some other means. But taking a look at our election here, we've got the moon. Whoa, what have I done? Hitting buttons. We've got the moon very angular in the first house, conjoined the ascendant. And at this time, she is applying the sextile to the sun in Taurus in the 10th house. And I like the sun-moon connection, just because the sun has a very kind of purifying and protective spiritual energy, which I think is very nice to be able to have in other electional opportunities involving this. Like the Western European version had the trine to Mars instead, and this is just sort of like a different flavor of this. The sun is very useful for spiritual protection because of its ability to clean, to cleanse and purify, and Mars can be good for spiritual protection for its ability to cut and separate and sever things. So it's just kind of different flavors of the same thing. But because the Cancer is on the ascendant, this also means that the moon is the ruler of the first house, and she's really all we need to watch out for when it comes to making sure there are no malevolent influences in this chart. So we want to make sure that the moon is not afflicted by Mars or Saturn, which she isn't. Applying the trine to Mars, which is fine, and averse to Saturn at this moment. Similarly, Cancer, 8 degrees Cancer. No malefic stuff going on here. The ruler of the first house is not ill-placed. All in all, it's just a pretty solid protective talisman. Definitely recommend grabbing it if you're interested in having one, whether or not you have a situation that the talisman needs to respond to immediately, or if you just think it might be good to have kind of in the war chest, so to speak, if you are ever in a situation where you need it in the future. Our next electional opportunity for Australia is actually just a few minutes later if you want. So you can definitely, once you get finished with your, ninth Lunar Mansion talisman, you can definitely just turn around and look at your next altar, your other altar behind you that's conveniently placed behind you, where you can then do a Sirius fixed star talisman opportunity. So Sirius is a fixed star in the constellation of Canis Major, the brightest fixed star in the sky. And when we're talking about Sirius within magical contexts, Sirius is primarily said to bring honor and goodwill, especially from people in authority. So, people kind of higher up the totem pole than you are more likely to, or you are more visible to their goodwill. They're more likely to, to give you nice things or, say nice things about you, which can be very helpful, depending on kind of where you are, what kind of career you're in. Sirius is also said to help strengthen and repair strained relationships, specifically spousal relationships is kind of the implication here in the texts. But of course, any relationship can be boosted to some extent by Sirius, even if they are not the kind of relationships that are kind of specifically indicated for this star in its magical descriptions. So even if you're not, half of a married couple who are going through a rough time, friends or family members, maybe you're having a falling out with, Sirius can help cushion that and maybe strengthen that. But it's just that Sirius is said to be specifically indicated for marital troubles. So kind of keep that in mind. And then finally, Sirius is said to give power over the spirits of the air, which I interpret primarily as being about like weather magic, I guess we would call it, and maybe even travel to some extent, especially air travel. So the fixed star Sirius is projected to 14 degrees of Cancer, and then we want to have that degree on the ascendant, while the moon is also applying a conjunction to that degree at the same time. While that's all going on, we also want the moon to be able to apply to a planet that's of the nature of Sirius immediately. And Sirius is a star that's of the nature of Jupiter and Mars. And in this chart, the moon's next aspect is a sextile to the sun. And I think this is fine for Sirius. There are a couple of stars that I think sun connections can work very well with. The first is Sirius, because Sirius has some kind of innately solar considerations associated with it. In ancient Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius making its first appearance in the pre-dawn sky, marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and the flooding of the Nile River. So there's that very kind of like solar quality, that calendric kind of like New Year kind of thing that I think fits very well with Sirius's energy. Another fixed star that I think operates very well with sun aspects is Regulus, clearly. So even though Sirius is not of the nature of the sun, I still think there's some kind of like inherent solar connection there that connections with the sun in Sirius talismanic charts really helps to bring out in a way that you don't see. But if it makes you guys feel any better, the moon's also applying this really tight trine to Mars, like almost immediately after. So I kind of tried to, this was an interesting election because you could kind of bring both in at the same time, but that moon-sun sextile is the most important because it is the most immediate. That's what's happening next immediately in this chart. But thankfully Sirius does have some solar history or connections or mythology associated with it that I think really makes this connection worth investing a talisman into. So that's our our Sirius election for for Australia. Western Europe and North Africa unfortunately didn't get one, but that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. All right, and then our third and our final election for the Australian continent is going to be for May 7th. I told you they're like all within a couple days. And this is going to be set just before 5 p.m. This chart's set for 4:58 p.m. And this is an opportunity for a 10th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 10th Lunar Mansion is one that I think is probably the most powerful when it comes to health considerations, especially within the context of like preventative medicine, strengthening the body, toning the body, making it more healthy, to be able to protect itself from disease, that kind of thing. But it also has some unique abilities to provide additional insight into mysterious or unusual health conditions, to get some answers out of those, and to connect people with doctors that they need to help them with whatever issue that they're experiencing. So I definitely recommend the 10th Lunar Mansion if you are somebody who any of those sound familiar to. If you've ever been in a situation where like, oh, that would have been really helpful, definitely grab a 10th Lunar Mansion talisman and hold on to it, especially if you can get a really great connection or a really great chart from it. But taking a look at our election here, we have the moon in the 10th house, conjunct the midheaven in the 10th Lunar Mansion, and at this time she's applying a trine, to Jupiter and Pisces. And Jupiter's in the 6th house here. I don't super usually pay attention to the house positions of the planet the moon is applying to. I don't super think it's all that important all the time. But I do kind of want to, and I don't even mention it most of the time, right? Like hardly ever do I mention it. But I wanted to mention it here because the 6th house is a house that is associated with illness. But I liked the moon's application to a benefic planet here because generally benefic planets, especially since Venus is here too, but generally benefic planets help to kind of stabilize the house that they're in. So the idea that like an illness can be stabilized, I think is a really nice thing for people. So I don't really hate Jupiter in the 6th house here in this chart because I think it makes sense just from like the context of what we're doing here, the context what this chart is for. It's for, stabilizing illness, for finding answers in illness. And I think the Jupiter-Venus conjunction in general can be very helpful for that. So if you're somebody who was interested in it but kind of like balked at the conjunction or the connection with Jupiter in the 6th house, I actually think it's kind of appropriate for what's happening. Now that does not mean that I would not have preferred like Jupiter in the 10th or in the 1st house. Absolutely I would have, but I don't think it sucks for it to be in the 6th house as much. I think it's very topical and very appropriate for what the talisman is for. So moving on, we've got Mars as the ruler of the 1st house because Scorpio is on the ascendant, and that points us to Mars here in Pisces in the 5th house. And Mars is doing fine. There's not a whole lot going on with Mars. It's got the sextile with the Sun, which is fun. It's not conjoined or square Saturn. Mars is doing fine. It's not afflicted. The moon's not afflicted. The ascendant is unafflicted. So all in all, I think it's fine. I think it's a good chart to go for strengthening health considerations, and definitely recommend it if you're not busy on a Saturday at 5 o'clock. Okay. Yes, Bubbles. One of these days, I'm just gonna get Bubbles to do all this. Like, I'm just gonna have her sit here, do my job. Or like if I can get her, what would be super cool is if I get her to like be still here, and then I can just like zoom on her and just talk, and then she can just like, maybe I can do like a Bubbles voice. So I make fun of Bubbles a lot. You hear her meows, right? Yeah, they're like very high pitched. So a lot of times I'm like, Bubbles! That's how I say her name to her. Bubbles! It's just like very high pitched and screamy. I can just do the whole video in that voice. It would be really hard, but I could do it. And then Bubbles just be sitting here, and then she could just talk you through the election opportunities for that 2-week period. We'll look into that. I'll get my people on it. So our first election opportunity for the North American continent was actually going to be this chart here for May 4th at around 3 in the morning as sort of like a surprise Saturn election because I didn't really see it coming. But here, for me at least in my location, so hopefully you'll be able to replicate this for yours elsewhere on the continent. You have Saturn here on the ascendant in Aquarius, very strong, with the moon applying a really nice, really strong trine from Gemini. This also happens during Saturn's hour, which I wasn't able to replicate elsewhere. That's why this is the only video that or the only section that has a Saturn talisman opportunity. There was a Saturn talisman opportunity that I ended up cutting from the video for Australia. So keep a look for that. I think it was on May 5th. with the moon in a very similar setup, with the moon applying to the trine of Saturn from Gemini. But the issue was the moon, it was so wide, it was like 16 degrees wide, the trine was, that I didn't really feel comfortable committing to it. But if I can't tell you no, so if you're still watching, people who are from Australia, and you're interested in a Saturn talisman, then look for that, that opportunity to pick it up. But I just didn't feel comfortable with it because the moon was so far from Saturn's trine that it was basically void, and I just didn't really like it as much. But so anyway, back to this chart here. I was going to offer this chart, and now I'm kind of on the fence about it, but since I already had it up before I realized what was happening, I'll go ahead and talk about it. So you do have this trine between the moon and Saturn, which is very useful. Saturn's very strong in Aquarius. Saturn is on the ascendant. It's Saturn's hour, so everything looks good. The only thing that I don't like about this chart, now looking at it, is that Mars is in the first house. And generally, you don't want a malefic in the first house because the first house is the person the talisman is for. And having malefics here can affect them and potentially make the talisman non-ideal, potentially dangerous in some way. And so generally, I'm very on the side of caution almost all the time. So now that I see this here, I don't really like it, and I would not, I think, recommend this to a beginner in good conscience. If you're more practiced in astrological magic and you think you can handle this Mars conjunct, like Mars in the first house, I can't tell you not to, obviously. I can just, give you the disappointed face instead, if you want. But I think you could also argue that Mars's presence in the first house is mitigated to an extent by Venus too, by the benefic conjunction in the first house. So maybe you want to take that into consideration as well, whether you like this kind of balance here for the mitigating factor or not, or if you even don't want to play ball at all, that's fine too. That would be kind of my stance on it as well. So yeah, there you go. I was going to offer this as a Saturn talismanic collection. I'm a little bit more hesitant to now, especially to beginners, because of the Mars being in the first house. I think there's a good argument to be made for the malevolence and potential damage or disruption that Mars could cause being balanced by the benefic conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, also in the first house. But yeah, that's something that I would say go for if you are a little bit more experienced in astrological magic, but probably don't if you are not as experienced. This would not be my first go around with the Saturn talisman, honestly. Sorry. So our next election opportunity, and maybe first real one, if you want to be particular about your phrasing, is going to be for May 4th at around 4:15 in the afternoon. This chart's set for 1612, and this is going to be an opportunity for a 7th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 7th Lunar Mansion is a mansion that is very similar to the 3rd Lunar Mansion, one that I've talked about before as being my favorite lunar mansion. That is still the case. The 7th Lunar Mansion is another mansion we can go to assist with the acquisition of all good things, much like the 3rd. So if you're in a situation where you could use more of the good things, which should be all of you, every last one of you deserves more good things, definitely consider picking up a 7th Lunar Mansion or a 3rd Lunar Mansion talisman that looks good for your location, or even one that maybe doesn't look so awesome, to kind of test it out and get a feel for it, kind of how it works, how and all that mess. In our election chart here, we've got the moon. I'm using yellow now. I like blue better. We have the moon in the 10th house conjoined the midheaven, and in the very last parts of the 7th Lunar Mansion. And at this time, she's applying this square to Venus and Aries. Generally, squares are not ideal connections because they tend to represent a little bit more effort on the petitioner's part to make the thing happen. You kind of have to get momentum going the right way yourself before the spirit's really able to kind of pick it up and roll with it in a way that you don't really have to if there's like sextiles or trines involved. So generally, squares are less ideal connections between the moon and the planet she's applying to that make that a little bit more difficult to handle. This is why, part of the reason why, squares can also afflict, which is why you'll never see me working in charts that have squares with Mars or Saturn. But squares with benefics are fine because benefics don't really afflict in the same kind of a way. They're a little bit more harmless. So you can lean on them. You can lean on squares between Jupiter, Venus, and the Sun in ways that you can't lean on squares between Mars and Saturn. Even Mercury squares are a little bit dicey because Mercury is shady. So keep that in mind. So the square here is not ideal, but Venus is a benefic planet and capable of bestowing good things. In Aries, you might argue that she was a little bit impeded in doing so. But all in all, she is a benefic planet. She does do her best to make things happen and connect for people. So I definitely think that while this is not what I would consider like a shining example of a 7th Lunar Mansion talisman, and definitely less advantageous than the Western Europe and North Africa version, which actually had the square to Jupiter and Pisces instead, I think it's fine. What's an interesting added thing for this, an added bonus, I guess, is that this is a venerated moon. If you're unfamiliar with the term, veneration is the benefic besiegement, I guess we'll say, to where the moon is caught in between the square of Jupiter and is applying to the square of Venus. So she's caught between the rays of the benefic planets, in the same way that, like, if we talked about the moon was separating from the square of Mars and applying a square of Saturn, she would be besieged between the between the malefics. Veneration is a really good, it's a really strong thing, even if it happens through more difficult aspects. It's really nice. So here we have like a nice, safe, venerated moon, which is sort of the trade-off, I guess. Western Europe and North Africa got a version of this chart with the moon applying to Jupiter and Pisces. But North America gets a version of this chart where the moon is venerated between the square of Jupiter and Pisces and Venus and Aries. So still a very strong configuration, a very nice configuration to have, and I definitely recommend grabbing this when you can. The ruler of the first house is Mercury here, because Virgo rises. Mercury's in Gemini doing well. Mercury's slowing down in this in preparation to turn retrograde. Not there yet, so we don't really have to worry about it as super affecting this chart. And the moon is also really slow in the signs of Cancer, Gemini, and Taurus. She's slow right now, so something to consider. Slow moons usually mean the talisman takes longer to manifest. So our next electional opportunity for North America is going to be on May 6th at just before 11 in the morning. This chart is set for 10:52. And this is going to be an opportunity for a 9th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 9th Lunar Mansion talisman in a waxing moon context is primarily utilized for spiritual protection and as a tool to assist one in spiritual cleansing in some contexts. So the 9th Lunar Mansion can be really helpful to utilize to help, get gross spiritual gunk off of you that you may have accumulated one way or another throughout the day. And it can be very useful to use as a tool to help weaken and detach malefic attachments that may have snuck in and connected themselves to you for whatever reason. It could also, the 9th Lunar Mansion I think is also helpful when it comes to combating or keeping the evil eye at bay. So just things to keep in mind. There's some different ways, I guess, to utilize the 9th Lunar Mansion. And in our election here, we have the moon and the ascendant in the 9th Lunar Mansion, and at this time, she is applying this trine here to Jupiter in Pisces. Sorry, I forgot what that sign was. It's applying this trine to Jupiter in Pisces, but Jupiter as a protective force is a good option. This has been an interesting 2-week period because while each of the 3 locations that I usually survey had an opportunity for a 9th Lunar Mansion talisman, they each have one of a different flavor. So Western Europe and North Africa had the Mars flavor, where it's much more attuned to like severing attachments, cutting those negative cords, and kind of helping to get things off of us in that regard. Australia had the connection with the sun. The sun is much more of a purifying entity, and that's really neat. And then now North America gets Jupiter, which is much more like a calming, stabilizing presence of kind of like the protective sphere of something, we'll say. And so I just think these are kind of like different, like really interesting ways to think about how these 3 planets kind of respond to the same job in different ways. Where Mars is sort of like the sword that cuts things that are connected to us. The sun is the fire which burns away kind of gross, dense spiritual stuff, sludge that's attached to us. And then Jupiter is sort of like the protective shell that kind of keeps things and bounces things off of us. So just kind of interesting way that happens out. In our election here, we've got Venus, who's very angular as a benefic planet, which I think is a nice little touch for the chart. But the moon is the ruler of the first house because Cancer rises, and she's unafflicted by anything. She's averse to Jupiter. She's separating from the trine to Mars, which is fine. And the ascendant isn't afflicted by anything either. So all in all, it's a pretty safe, pretty nice place to be for a 9th Lunar Mansion talisman. So I definitely recommend picking this up if you've been looking for some sort of talisman to help with handling negative energies or the accumulation of negative gunk that you may have experienced or may be worrying about experiencing as you kind of maneuver around your own spiritual practice. So our next electional opportunity for North America is going to be on May 5th at around what's 530? I forgot what 1700 was for a minute. And this chart is set for 1735. And this is going to be an opportunity for a Sirius fixed star talisman. Sirius is this fixed star that's in the constellation of Canis Major, the brightest star in the sky. And magically, when we talk about Sirius, we talk about it in regards to its ability to have people who are higher in authority than us exhibit goodwill to us. So this can be very useful, especially like depending on your career, when it comes to getting recommendations from bosses for this or the other thing, or you can even use it a little bit more like legally, we'll call it, in like the legal sphere, to get sympathetic judgments from judges or better treatment from police officers, or things like that. Since this is like the people who are authority figures, goodwill from authority figures, and there are many different kinds of authority figures depending on context that this talisman can help you with. So something to keep in mind, especially if you kind of work more day to day in the legal sphere. Like I think a Sirius talisman could be very helpful for like a lawyer in a way, kind of very similar to a Spica talisman, but a little bit a different branding of that same powers, we'll say, or even to Nebogiti. There's a little bit of a connection there. They're all three very useful for legal pursuits, but for different ways. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to go off track on that. Additionally, Sirius is used for reconciliation between spouses. So if you are, going through a bit of a marriage struggle, a kind of a bump in your marriage, Sirius can kind of help you guys get back on the same page. Even though Sirius is specifically indicated for marital issues, that's not the only kind of relationship that Sirius can help with. So even like, strained family, or friend relationships or things like that, or even just kind of like generally relationships within the community or a relationship with community, Sirius can help try to, mend those roads and get things back together. But Sirius is specifically indicated for marriage concerns, so just kind of keep that in mind if you're going to approach Sirius from that way. Can still help, but maybe isn't like the silver bullet to the problem that it would be if it was more of a marriage concern that you were addressing to Sirius. And then finally, Sirius is talked about as having command over the spirits of the air, which I think primarily as being probably like weather magic kind of thing, but maybe also air travel. So just some different flavors of utilization for Sirius there. Let's see, Sirius is at 14 degrees of Cancer. So we want to put 14 degrees Cancer on the midheaven or the ascendant. Here we have it on the midheaven in the Australian version. We had it on the ascendant. And the moon is applying to that degree, and at the same time, we would want the moon to apply to a planet that is of the nature of Sirius. Sirius is of the nature of Jupiter and Mars, so most of the time we would want a connection between those two planets with the moon. We don't have that here because I'm being contrary, but instead we have the moon applying the sextile to the sun. Well, my pen would draw. There we go, applying a sextile to the sun. And I think this is very appropriate because even though Sirius is not specifically of the nature of the sun, Sirius has some pretty strong solar connections that I think make a connection with the sun very appropriate for this star. When in ancient Egypt, when Sirius would make its heliacal rise, so its first appearance in pre-dawn hours, it would mark the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and the annual flooding of the Nile River. And so this is what I mean by like a strong solar connection. There's a strong connection between Sirius and like calendrics and a relationship with the sun, the heliacal rise, that I think makes the sun another good option for a moon application in a way that it probably wouldn't work for other stars, other than like Regulus. There's a pretty solid sun argument to be made for that star too, being the alpha star of Leo. But so we have the star on an angle, the moon applying to the star, and the moon applying to an appropriate planet. But we also always want to pay attention to the ruler of the first house. In this instance, it is Venus, because Libra is on the ascendant, which points us down here to Venus in Aries in the 6th house. Venus is unafflicted by Mars or Saturn, and the ascendant is as well, the ascendant degree. The moon is safe too. So all in all, it's a pretty okay chart. Of course, Venus's position in the 6th and in Aries is probably not super ideal, but our focus is really more on the moon in Sirius here. We just want to make sure that Venus isn't afflicted, combust, retrograde, things like that. And our final election for the North American continent and for our video is going to be on May 7th at just before 11:30. This is going to be an opportunity for a 10th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 10th Lunar Mansion is an amazingly helpful talisman when it comes to health concerns, specifically more the strengthening of the body, preventative medicine, helping the body to ward off illness and disease. But it also has had some unique, I've also had some unique experiences with it, to where the 10th Lunar Mansion has been instrumental in helping solve mysterious health conditions, and to kind of like getting the patient to a doctor that they need to see, which the meaning of that changes based on context. But all in all, the 10th Lunar Mansion has been a super amazing talisman to work with in my experience, and I recommend everybody to develop a relationship with the 10th Lunar Mansion talisman, but especially somebody who suffers from like a chronic disease or somebody who's in and out of doctors' offices a lot. There's something about the 10th Lunar Mansion that is amazingly helpful in these regards. Looking at our election here, we have the moon close to the ascendant in the 10th Lunar Mansion, and at this time she's applying the trine to Venus. Super helpful. Venus is a benefic planet and capable of bestowing health and regenerating health, which I think is really great. The ruler of the first house is the moon, so we really have to look out for her, and we don't have to worry about afflictions from Mars or Saturn yet. There is an opposition to Saturn later on in the sign, which is why we don't have like an 11th Lunar Mansion talisman, for instance. But for the moon in the 10th Lunar Mansion, this is fine. Not close enough to worry about yet. So initially I was thinking of having this election with Leo rising instead of Cancer rising to put the moon closer to the ascendant, but I opted to have the moon as the ruler of the first house instead of the sun because I'm still not super comfortable with the proximity of the sun to the node here, which I think is more of a problem for the sun specifically, the sun and the moon specifically, because the node indicates positions where they are eclipsed, whereas I don't think the nodes are such a big deal when it comes to normal planetary conjunctions because they are not eclipsed in those points. So they don't really experience the nodal positions in the same way. So I did kind of want to stay clear of the sun and the node as having a super prominent meaning for charts. So that's why there's no Leo ascendants for any of the elections that I've talked about in any of the locations. I don't feel super comfortable with the sun being that instrumental, being ruler of the first house, which is like the number 2 spot essentially in any election chart. So I don't recommend having a Cancer. I don't recommend having a Leo rising for this chart, having a Cancer. So I recommend the Cancer ascendant. If you're unable to catch the Cancer ascendant, there isn't a second option for this chart, which takes place later that day, at around like 6:30, 6:45. And this is one very similar situation, except now you have, of course, the moon on the midheaven. In this 10th Lunar Mansion, she's still applying the trine to Venus, as you can see, and Venus is now the ruler of the first house. Venus is unafflicted, not combust the sun, not conjoined or square Mars or Saturn. The ascendant degree as well is also free from any of those afflictions. So I think this could be a good second. I like Venus. I like the first one just because I like the trine between the first and the 9th house a little bit more than I like the trine between the first and the 6th house. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it because the 6th house is a house that's associated with illness, of course, and I don't hate that Venus is in the 6th house because it's very topical to what the election is for. Like the election is for a talisman to assist with health matters, so I think it's fine to have the ruler of the first house in the 6th house. Like that's what we're focused on. That's what we want. We want help to resolve this, especially if it's a benefic planet that also has Jupiter conjoined its cusp, the 6th house cusp. So there's a lot of good to dig out from that, but I just generally, at the end of the day, I think trines between the 1st and 9th are a bit more fortuitous than trines between the 10th and the 6th. That's just kind of how they're built, I think. But either option should help you out, especially while we kind of wait for an even better configuration, an even more stunning 10th Lunar Mansion, which will come to us one day. But either option, either this sort of more 6:30 option, or the option that happened earlier that day at around 11:30 will be fine to get you through. But alrighty, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me to watch and get some more ideas about electional opportunities coming your way in your part of the world. Hopefully there's something here for you guys that you're looking forward to, that you can start getting things together to help out in your own lives, whatever's going on in your situation. I wanted to say thank you to all my lovely, awesome, and supportive patrons for all the support that they've given. And if you are interested in seeing how you can support the development of our Talismanic Collection series and my other astrological adventures, check out the links below on how you can do that, either by following me on social media and staying in touch, signing up for my newsletter, or subscribing to the Patreon yourself. But alright, thank you guys so much, and I will see you guys again on our Scorpio Lunar Eclipse. And everybody, be safe, take care, and be gentle with yourselves between these 2 eclipses. And I'll see you guys in the next one.